Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the farm. We're going to do a short video this morning on how to service or check your wheel bearings on a trailer. Very useful skill to have. So stick with us and we'll show you how to do it. So anytime you're going to pull a trailer, especially if it's going to be a longer distance, you want to make sure that your bearings are in good order, because believe me, there is nothing like being stuck on the side of the road with a bad wheel bearing. It's not like just changing a tire. You need some parts for that, and a lot of times stores are few and far between, and not all of them are going to have the bearing parts that you need. So you're going to be stuck if you got a bad wheel bearing. So we borrowed a trailer from my cousin, and part of that deal was I told him that I would make sure the bearings were in good working order, especially since I'm going to use it too. So upon driving it home, we did find out that one of the bearings was getting warm, almost too warm, which leads me to believe it may be just a little too tight. Because when they're too tight, it causes extra friction on the bearings and it causes them to heat up. So this hub that we're checking with the bearings in it has recently been taken off, and it wasn't checked after it got serviced. So we're going to do that real quick and we'll bring you along. So the first thing we did after hooking up the trailer is we rolled it up on our no jack block. All that is a tapered block made out of 2x8s. And when you have a tandem axle like this, it's very convenient. You don't have to use a jack. You just roll it up onto that block. And I'll show you what else you got to do. Always, always, always make sure you have on the other side of the trailer, make sure you chalk both sides of the tires. And if you have a trailer and you don't have these wheel chocks, you need to get some. Because whenever you park a trailer, you need to make sure it's not rolling around on you. Also, we set the parking brake on the truck, so the truck's not going to move either, and it's going to help this keep this from moving around. Next thing we got to do is we're going to take our impact wrench and we're going to pull this tire off. Now, unlike a flat tire, with a flat tire, while this trailer is still on the ground, is one you want to loosen the lug nuts because it'll keep the tire from spinning. And then once you get the lug nuts loose is when you jack it up, and then you can pull the wheel off. But because this is not a flat tire and it's going to come off pretty easily, we're not doing it by hand, we can use the impact wrench. So we are using our cordless Ryobi impact wrench. This was my purchase for myself, my gift for Christmas. It's the highest torque model that they have. It's a newer model. So we're going to buzz these off. Also, a very pleasant surprise was these wheels have the rubber caps on them. And this axle is greasable. Not all your old axles have this grease dirt, and this grease dirt will send grease in between both bearings and spread out to where you don't have to pull all your bearings apart to grease the insides. Very, very nice update on these axles. None of the old axles have this, and you can tell they'll have a rubber plug in the end of it. Used to be you'd have to knock this whole cap off to pull the bearings and everything like this. This one you just pull the rubber plug out of. Alright, we removed the tire and wheel. Most of the time it's a 13/16 socket. And make sure you're using the impact socket, not a regular socket. One of the big things that people pulling trailers do is they think the lug wrench from their vehicle will work on the trailer. And a lot of times it won't. So make sure if you're pulling a trailer that you check that. Now the next order of business is we need to take this cap off, and you can't do that without pulling the hub and the wheel, or the tire and wheel. Just take a hammer and tap on the side back this way on both sides, and that will pop right off. Alright, we got the bearing cap off, and the good news is there's still plenty of grease in here, because when a hub gets hot, sometimes that grease will liquefy a little bit and it'll start to run out like the oil seal in the back. But since there's plenty of grease in here, it hasn't got terribly hot. Now when we pull the tire off and I start messing around with this, can you hear that? That leads me to believe that we have another problem. The brakes are actually dragging. So I'm going to fix that. But if you needed to back this off, if the bearing was too tight, there's a cotter pin in here. I don't know if you could see it. You would need a pair of pliers to bend this back around straight, and then you pull the cotter pin out, and then there's notches in this nut. So you don't have to go a full revolution to put the cotter pin back in. About every eighth of a nut, there's a notch that lets that cotter pin go through. So sometimes your cotter pin will go all the way through the center, but because these are the new ones with the grease zerk in the spindle itself, the cotter pin goes just along one side. So this is the top of the cotter pin there, if you can see that, and it goes straight down through, and then the end of it's bent up clear around here. You can see that moving in there a little bit. So you would pull that cotter pin out, and you would back this nut off, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So we want to go left, and you'd go back one notch if this was too tight. Back one notch, put the cotter pin back in, bend it around, and then you just put your cup back on, as long as there's plenty of grease in there. And then that should solve your heating problem if your bearing is way too tight. But we're going to adjust these brakes, and I'll show you the tool that we're going to use to do that. So this is the outer brake drum, and behind it right here you can see the backing plate, which is bolted to the end of the axle. On the back side of the backing plate, usually on the bottom, there's a little rubber plug that looks like this, and you got to take that out. And remember, if you're crawling under vehicles like this, make sure you use jack stands and whatever other safety measures you can use. You don't want to get crushed under here. So once this plug is out, you need either what's called a brake spoon, which looks a lot like something like this, but this is not actually one, or a flat-bladed screwdriver. And because this is a dropped axle trailer, the axle drops down right behind that hole. So it's going to be pretty difficult getting in that hole with this piece of the axle right here. But inside that hole, you're probably not going to be able to see it. But there's a slack adjuster. It's about this long, and it's round, and it's got teeth around the middle. And you're just bumping those teeth with that spoon or the screwdriver one way or the other to either loosen or tighten this. All it basically is a bolt that goes inside of each other. And if you spin it one way, it goes out. If you spin it another way, it goes in. So if you're spinning it out, it causes the brakes to expand and get tighter. So we want to go in. And you'll know if you're spinning it the wrong way, because this will get too tight and stop moving. So if you're doing the wrong way, you'll know, because this will stop. If you're doing it the other way, that dragging sound is going to go away. So I'm going to start adjusting this, and we'll come back when we're done. So we had that plug off the back. I got back there feeling around with the brake spoon, could not find the slack adjuster. Got the flashlight, looked in there, couldn't even see a slack adjuster. So there was no way that I could find to adjust those brakes. So we're going to do this the hard way, which is to pull the hub so I can actually see the brakes and see where the adjustment is, adjust it down, slide the hub back on, see if it still drags, and do it that way. So first things first, like we were talking about before, straighten out your cotter pin here. Straight down like that. You want to line it up a little bit, make sure everything's in line. Still a little crooked, I believe. Always nitrile glove too, because this is a nasty greasy mess. I'm going to straighten that out, bend this around a little bit. It's hard to get that last curve out of there. So let's see if we can pull it from the top. Nope, not yet.
Brandy.
Tap that pin out of there. You can see why it wouldn't come out. It's got that darn bend in it. We'll straighten that while we got it out. What are you growling at, Brandy? Alright, that should go in a lot better. Now I got a nice clean box down here I can put all my parts in so they're not getting dirty down on the ground. So now we're going to spin this nut off, and I like using channel locks for that. Need to go one. So we're going to take this nut all the way off, and behind this nut there should be a washer that goes between the nut and the bearing. And it looks like the bearing's coming out with the nut. The grease is holding it together. So you can see the nut. The washer will sometimes have a flat area on the inside. This one does not, because sometimes on the spindle there'll be a flat side to keep that washer from spinning. So now we need to ease that bearing out of there. You'll notice your bearing is tapered. It goes into a tapered race, which holds everything together. Still plenty of grease in that bearing, so we're not going to have to repack it. And I want to check the bearing for any slop, because if the needle bearings in here are getting loose, you'll feel a lot of slop in that bearing, and there's no slop. So that is still a very good bearing. We don't have to worry about that. So now this hub will slide off, and there's an oil seal on the back of the hub that holds the rear bearing in. We're going to take these gloves off so we don't get grease all over everything. So we don't have to worry about that rear bearing falling out. Slides off just like that. Got a little bit of brake dust in there that you can see. We'll take all that out. But you'll see your bearing inside. This is your oil seal here to keep your grease inside your spindle. That seal is still in pretty good shape. It's not cracked or there's no rough spots in it. So that's pretty good. So now we're going to look for an adjuster. You got a spring down here and no adjuster. So I'm going to figure out how these brakes adjust, and once we figure it out, we'll come back and see you. Alright, we found our slack adjuster. It's way back in here, quite a ways from the notch or the hole in the back. It's about 1.5 inches into that slack adjuster. So there is one in there. We're just going to have to reach in a lot farther now that we know it's lined up perfectly with that slot. I'm going to squirt a little brake free on this, make sure these threads are nice and clean before I put this back together. We still got plenty of surface on our brake pads here. I mean, it's not a whole lot, but it's plenty to keep going. We don't have to change the pads. So I'm going to gingerly slide all this back on, put it back together, and I'm going to adjust the brakes from the back now that I know where that thing's at. Now I'll show you about these new spindles while I have this off. It's the perfect time. They're putting a grease dirt out here now on the end of the spindle. And what that does is it sends grease back here in between the two bearings, and the grease goes into the bearings from the back or the front side of each bearing. So you don't have to pull all of this off, pack everything with grease, and shove it back on. You can grease it right from here without pulling everything apart. Very, very good design. I don't know why they didn't come up with this years ago, but I'm real happy to see this. It's going to make life easier. All right, we got everything put back together. Remember the bearing first, tapered side in, then the washer, then the nut. And then you're going to tighten the nut to where there's no more play in this hub. You can't push it in and out at all, but it still spins pretty freely. If it wasn't for that brake dragging in there, this would spin really freely. And then put your cotter pin back down through, all the way in like that. And then I like bending it both ways, and you only got to bend it enough to where it doesn't contact your grease cap when it goes in there. And then we'll bend this one this way, like that. Make sure this one's bent far enough, like that. And then we'll make sure our cap will go back on without hitting that cotter key, and it does. So we'll take our soft hammer and we'll tap that right back on there. Kind of go around it as you go. Make sure it's fully seated in there. And I'm going to leave that rubber cap off for now because I'm going to shoot a couple squirts of grease out of our grease gun in there. So time to crawl back underneath. All right, after we were able to find that slack adjuster back in the back, we were able to pop it down a few notches, and we freed it up quite a bit. Now it almost free spins. You can still hear a little noise. That's just kind of the brake just resting on it, but there's no real pressure. But we got a good spin, and we don't have any slack in and out. If the nut was too loose, you would feel this hub going back and forth on the spindle. But we're perfect. So we're going to put a couple pumps of grease into this thing. That should be plenty. Ugh. And those things are hard to get off. We're going to put our rubber plug back in there. There we go. So now we're going to put this tire back on, and we'll show you a couple tricks for that. Now, a trick to getting your tire back on if you don't have the physical upper body strength to lift these, and with bigger tires, none of us do, but most of us can muscle these on. But say you're a lady and you're having trouble getting this up, grab you a bar, and a lot of times your tire iron that comes with your car would work for this. Shove it up underneath your tire like this and hold on to the other side of your tire. And then all you got to do is lift it up like that. And then you're going to kind of line it up. Just keep moving it around until your lug nuts line up, kind of like that. You see this one's getting ready to line up. And then just pick it up a little bit and it'll slide right on. Very easy way to do it. The old tire guys do that with the big rig tires. Also with your lug nuts, if you're ever at a tire shop and you're not experienced with tires, I always watch people when they do my tires at the tire shops, because a lot of it, some of these amateur guys will throw your lug nut in there, pop it on, and then start spinning. That cross threads your threads. So if you see somebody doing that, they don't know what the hell they're doing, you need to tell them to get away from your vehicle. So always start your lug nuts by hand so you can feel if they're cross threaded or not. Every single lug nut got to be started by hand. I even watch people when they change my oil, because I've had a couple times where they did not put the oil back in the vehicle. So I always make sure and watch that the oil is going back in the vehicle. It's another good time to check your lug nuts or your lug studs. Make sure that none of them are loose, wanting to fall out. So all these are started by hand. Now we can take our impact, and you want to go across from each other. These nuts are tapered on the back side so they center the wheel as they tighten. You'll see there's a taper on the inside of the hole here that matches the taper on the lug nut. So your taper always goes in, and we'll go opposite of that, and that wheel is centered now. So we'll hit all these other ones, just run them into where they touch. So now we're going to start tightening them. Go across. Okay, so you want to go all the way around, make sure you're watching your socket. You don't want to just keep hammer it until it stops and won't go no more. It's just barely turning, and that's what I'm looking for, and I made sure all of them were turning about the same amount. So we've got this done. That wheel spins much better, and that probably will no longer heat up on me, but we're going to check it when we go into town. So we're just going to get a rag and kind of clean that grease off of there so we don't attract any more dirt. But that's it. If you got any questions about this video, feel free to put them in the comments. It's not rocket science. The other thing, make sure that I want to mention real quick, if you're going on a trailer trip, check the air pressure in your tires. Make sure you got the correct air pressure, because if your pressure is low, which if your trailer sits for a while, it's going to get low, it causes these tires to move too much as they flatten out on the ground, and they'll get hot and they fail. And that's why a lot of people pulling trailers get blown out tires, because they heat up and they explode. So always check your air pressure in your tire. So we love you guys. Stay safe, stay healthy. Till next time, we'll see you back on Markelly Farm.